Hello everybody, and welcome to today's lecture on academic reflections on last topics. As you know, today we will be talking a little bit more about artificial intelligence, and especially that concept closely related to artificial intelligence, big data. Now, in particular, today we want to explore this theme that was introduced to you last Wednesday by Professor Hirsch-Ballin. We want to explore it from a philosophical perspective and ask some questions about the worldview that underlies today's big data debate. In discussing this worldview and some of the assumptions, some of the starting assumptions of this debate, we will touch on two further themes. First of all, we'll be talking about privacy. A very relevant topic today. As you know, previous examples we have discussed include that COVID-19 app that is being developed, possibly developed here in the Netherlands, other apps already in use elsewhere. And we'll also be talking about judgment, that is to say, in particular, personal judgment. How can we think as individuals, as autonomous individuals, in the age of big data? In order to have some concrete examples, I want you to watch a couple of links on Canvas. First of all, there are actually two scenes I want you to watch that are taken from the Black Mirror episode Nosedive. If you see the whole episode, great. You don't have to watch the whole thing. If you can, I strongly advise it. But definitely watch those two scenes on Canvas, just a few minutes each to get an idea of what that episode is about. Now that, of course, is fiction. I also want you to watch another clip that is fact or close to becoming fact on China's social credit system. Again, also a link on Canvas. Now, if you haven't already, head over to Canvas, watch those two clips, because having them in the back of your mind as we go through today's lecture will be very helpful to you. Today we'll be digging a little deeper into the theory of Shoshana Zuboff. You remember her and you remember this slide from a few weeks ago when we also talked about Friedrich Hayek and central planning. This quote bears repeating. The combination, Zuboff writes in Surveillance Capitalism, a big book I highly recommend, the combination of state surveillance and its capitalist counterpart means that digital technology is separating the citizens in all societies into two groups, the watchers and the watched. And it is in particular these two groups, and in particular this divide, that we'll be looking into today. This divide has profound consequences for democracy because asymmetry of knowledge translates to asymmetry of power. We'll talk about that a little more too in a bit. Whereas most democratic societies have at least some degree of oversight of state surveillance, we currently have almost no regulatory oversight of its privatized counterparts. And this, according to Zuboff, is intolerable. Now, who are these privatized counterparts, part of what she calls surveillance capitalism? The big five. Again, we discussed these before, at least mentioned them: Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. Zuboff has done a particularly close study of Google because Google, according to her, was really the first mover in that whole surveillance capitalism debate. Consider this quote from Eric Schmidt. Eric Schmidt currently is the chair of the United States Defense Innovation Advisory Board and used to be the CEO of Google for 10 years, between 2001 and 2011. This is a quote from an interview with him in 2009. This is when it had just become known that Google retained private search data. So that, again, this is more than 10 years ago. This is when it first became known that Google actually saved information about your searches and other private data. Schmidt said, in defense of Google, in defense of their own approach to the issue, if you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. But if you really need that kind of privacy, the reality is that search engines, including Google, do retain this information for some time. It is possible that that information could be made available to the authorities. Now, I want to especially direct your attention to two aspects of this quote. First of all, if you look at that, the first part of the quote, there is the assumption that good people don't need privacy. If you have something to hide, that implies you're already guilty. You shouldn't have anything to hide. You should just be good, do good things, and you have nothing to fear, right? Anything about you could become known, and no problem because you've done nothing wrong. Furthermore, and this now I direct your attention especially to the second part of the quote, look at the way he phrases these issues. The reality is that search engines, including Google, do retain this information for some time. So this is the Google CEO, and he presents this as inevitable. This is simply what Google does. It is possible that that information could be made available to the authorities. Note the passive voice there. It could be made available. He doesn't say, we will make it available, or we could make it available. No, it could be made available to the authorities. So implicit in this quote is the sense that big data is inevitable. It's an inevitable consequence of technological advances. Big data just is. It's unstoppable. It's just this juggernaut that we're confronted with. We have to deal with it in some way, but its very existence itself is not questioned. Now, we want to know a little bit more about the data in big data. We've heard this term, we probably use it ourselves every now and then, but what exactly are we talking about? Big data can refer to many different things. Among them, first of all, data from computer-mediated economic transactions. That is to say, stock market exchanges, purchases big and small that happen through computers and therefore are computer mediated. Now this is very straightforward and also no big secret. Of course these data are collected. You probably know this, at least on some level, when you use a computer for some kind of economic transaction. The next category is perhaps more interesting to us. These are the data from sensors embedded in objects, bodies, and places. So you can think here about the information collected by drones, by all kinds of wearables, right? Be they Google watchers or step counters or what have you. Self-driving cars, nanoparticles that patrol the body for signs of disease, smart devices for the home, right? Think of thermostats and smart fridges, that sort of thing. And all the components really of the growing network of smart sensors and internet-enabled devices. We've mentioned these before, as you probably recall. Zuboff here, again from her book Surveillance Capitalism, nearly every product or service that begins with the word smart or personalized, every internet-enabled device, every digital assistant is simply a supply chain interface for the unobstructed flow of behavioral data on its way to predicting our futures in a surveillance economy. Another source of data, right, another kind of data included in these big data, are data from corporate and government databases. So you can think here about those databases associated with banks, payment clearing intermediaries, credit rating agencies, airlines, tax and census records, healthcare operations, credit card companies, insurance, pharmaceutical, telecom companies, etc. All of these companies have databases, and it is oftentimes, to a large extent, unknown to us, the consumers, the users, what part of this data is being shared and with whom. Furthermore, data from private and public surveillance cameras. You can think here of satellites. You've no doubt looked at Google Earth before, and when it first came out, we, I think, all were amazed that we could see our own backyard or our own house from space. This sense of wonder, Zuboff wants us to pause for a moment and think what it implies. So these are both public and private surveillance cameras. It can be images drawn from iPhones, right, when you use your phone camera and things are uploaded to the cloud. But again, it can be state-sponsored satellites or, of course, very importantly, all the images collected by Google. Now, this is what Shoshana Zuboff says about Google Street View in an article, Big Other. It's a very good article, very readable. I'm uploading it to Canva, so this is optional reading if you want to learn a little bit more about Zuboff's take on these matters. But from this article, there she writes, in Street View, Google developed a declarative method that it has repeated in other data ventures. This modus operandi is that of incursion into undefended private territory until resistance is encountered. So what does she mean here? How does Google approach the world? Maybe you've seen the Google Maps Street View cars, right? They're everywhere, constantly recording streets, scenery, nature. It just does this, right? Google asked nobody for permission. And in fact, Google Street View has by now been restricted in some countries, like for example, in Germany to some extent. Because what does Google do? It simply captures images, captures footage that seems to belong to nobody, but doesn't it, right? Google simply started doing this under the motto, ask for forgiveness, not for permission, right? It goes ahead and captures all kinds of different data. In this case, we're talking about street scenes and imagery. It captures all these data and then sometimes gets tied up in court in prolonged legal battles, which it tends to win because Google has much more money than pretty much anybody else. But again, think here about the kind of worldview this implies. It implies that these data are simply there for the taking. Some people in discussing Google have compared its approach to the colonialists and imperialists of bygone eras. Here's a painting from 1541, the Spanish conquistador founding Santiago de Chile. The idea that, okay, we found this new land, we're going to put a flag in it and declare it our own. That is colonialism. Of course, we know that this land wasn't theirs. Perhaps it was nobody's, but if it belonged to anyone, it probably was to the indigenous people living there. Now, of course, there are significant differences here. What this is meant to show is that Google simply goes out and takes images of your house, right? From space, from the street. And can it do this? Well, there's no regulation, there's no law telling Google not to do this. So we're constantly running behind these cynics, say, right, these skeptics of companies like Google and the like Zuboff. They're simply taking stuff, and they can take it because the law is running a few steps or perhaps even miles behind the facts here. One important thing to bear in mind is that to these companies like Google, every bit of data, no matter how trivial, has potential value. You can perhaps more easily see why people would object out of privacy concerns to Google capturing images of their house or their yard, even if you don't care particularly. But even your Facebook likes, or the fact that you like to watch cat videos on YouTube or Google for recipes for sourdough bread, all of this seemingly incredibly trivial information has potential value in surveillance capitalism. This, at least, is Shoshana Zuboff's argument. This is a quote from Google's chief economist, Hal Varian. And Zuboff thinks it's particularly interesting to look at his writings. He wrote quite a bit about Google's approach to big data. Zuboff thinks it's interesting to look at his writings in particular because this, again, is an economist perspective on the workings of Google. Because transactions are now computer mediated, he writes, we can observe behavior that was previously unobservable. And again, this can be incredibly detailed behavior that most people wouldn't care 2 bits about. But when packaged up, this kind of information, this data, can provide very detailed profiles for each individual, and then that can of course be used for targeted advertising, political purposes, etc. Also, this should remind you of the author we previously discussed, Friedrich Hayek, and again we talked about him in combination with Zuboff just a few weeks ago, Who has all this information? Remember that Hayek's big fear was centralization. Who has the information? What do they do with it? And is this in any way transparent to us? Hayek, as you know, pleaded for decentralization. Don't centralize all this knowledge in one place because, as we will see shortly, knowledge is power.